Good evening, everybody. Nice to see you. Good to be here. It's been a while. I was known Nina and Ajahn Larry for over 20 years now. I was invited to the centre in Chippendale before this centre was opened, and I was at the opening ceremony of this centre. Long time ago. How many years ago was that? 22 years ago, yeah. I think, and I used to stay with Ajahn Larry when he was just Larry. I think in his apartment in the rocks. His mother, I'm sure, blames me at least in part for him becoming a monk. Nice Dharma discussions we had late at night in his apartment. So it's just my sister recently passed away, and which is what brought me back to Australia from Thailand. So I've been reflecting a little bit upon this human situation and upon life and death. And it's interesting, it seems to be that within one lifetime we have several lives. And if you consider when you're a child and a baby in kindergarten, etc., it's a different world really, isn't it? All of the relationships that you had at that time compared to the relationships you have now. Probably high school was a different kind of a world, different kind of a life. And then you have the world and the life of the young working adult, and then you have the world and the life of a middle-aged person. And if you live to be old, a lot of your friends might pass away. You have a different kind of a life, and our friendships and relationships often changing. And so I had that kind of surreal experience today, coming back to Sydney, and we went to the art gallery. Ajahn Larry was kind enough to take me to the art gallery. And I used to live in Sydney 32 years ago, and but there's a sense of it, now is a sense of it being like a past life. In my past life, I lived in Sydney, because for the last 30 years, I've lived predominantly in Thailand, and so I eat Thai food, I speak Thai, I see a lot of Thai people's faces, and so my life changed. For the last 3 years, I've been a Thai citizen also. But it's nice to come back, and one of the things that I was remembering was when I was 21 and 22, was wondering what I was going to do with my life, and if I would somehow manage to find any happiness in my life. And you'll be happy to know I did. I found some happiness in my life, and it's always nice when you come back and it's like, oh, okay, remember your mind states from a few decades ago, and if there's been some progress or some evolution, that's a nice thing to observe. Being one of 6 children, my elder sister Jane was child number 3. I'm child number 4. We never know which one's going to exit the stage left first, do we? We don't know who will be the first one to die. And Jane isn't the oldest, which is interesting. I have an elder brother, John, an elder brother's sister, Diane, and then Jane. But Jane was the one who developed a brain tumor. So Jane has left us first. But it's it's a poignant contemplation. My mother is 85, and it's a very particular type of painful experience for a mother when the child dies before them. And so my mother's struggling a little bit with that sense of it's time for her to go. She wouldn't have minded going, but the daughter went first. These things point, according to our Buddhist understanding or beliefs, to the law of karma. Different karmas that we've cultivated, not just in or accumulated, not just in this life, but also in previous lives. Some people will have a shorter lifespan, some people will have a longer lifespan. And when I was a young man, I was interested. We had an Uber driver, and when I was a young man in Sydney, one of the things I'd considered was trying to study acting at the National Institute of Dramatic Art. And turns out our Uber driver had just graduated from the National Institute of Dramatic Art, and is having some difficulty finding work. It's like, even if you graduate from NIDA, doesn't necessarily mean you get the jobs. And it was just interesting, hey, that could have been me. I could have graduated from NIDA and ended up driving Ubers. But he may still be successful in his acting career. I wished him so. So life is full of potentialities, I suppose, possible paths. Another thing that occurred recently was my mother lives on the Gold Coast, and I visited Springbrook National Park. And I had thought about 15 years ago that I might open a branch monastery in Australia. And Springbrook was the place where I wanted to do it. It's in the Gold Coast hinterlands. And it just so happens that there's a property for sale. It would have been perfect. And I don't think properties like that come on the market very often. There was about 80 acres, spring-fed dams adjoining the national park, already built houses, 11 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms. And it was interesting. Oh, that would have made a nice monastery. But I still don't know anybody who might have offered $8 million. So that didn't happen. Plan B happened. But it's just interesting. Oh, that would have been a different kind of nice life, probably. So when we look at the news of late, I guess it's always been this way. But having a little look at the news, the situation in the Middle East is looking pretty bad. And I guess they're fortunate down here in Australia is that it is on the other side of the world, and it does seem a long way away. But with the way that human beings, the kind of weapons that have been developed, it is a bit of a worry. And so sometimes, in Buddhist practice, Lord Buddha encourages us to be mindful of death. And sometimes it's more obvious, sometimes it's easier, sometimes we forget, and we get in our habits, and there's a latent assumption that we will live a long life, and or at least an assumption that we probably won't die today. And one of the problems with this latent assumption that we have is that we can get stuck in not so skillful habits, and then like mice running around in wheels, and then we can essentially waste a lot of time, or at least not focus on the things which would benefit us most. So one of the recommendations of Lord Buddha is to contemplate awareness of impermanence and awareness of death, and for several reasons. One of the most obvious reasons is that if we can acknowledge that we really might die today, then it becomes the more frivolous or unskillful habits that we might have, it becomes easier to not give our attention to that. And we tend to think about what might be more useful. If we're really mindful that death could occur today, tomorrow, this week, this month, rather than assuming that it's probably a decade or 2 or 3 away. On another level, the grasping at the body and the feelings and consciousness as being a self is also directly related to this inherent assumption that things are somewhat permanent. And when we contemplate death and dying in a methodical, disciplined way, then it's chipping away at that assumption a little bit, and the grasping. So the first noble truth of unsatisfactoriness, the second noble truth is the craving for bhava tanha, kama tanha, bhava tanha, vibhava tanha, the craving, clinging. When we assume that we're going to be around for a long time, there's a lot to cling to, a lot to crave for. When we are mindful that it might not last for very long, this does something to the craving and the clinging. We hold it more lightly. We don't have as many assumptions. And so this also helps to prepare the mind for having insight. If we're receptive to, conversant with, familiar with the concept that this body can die today, I might not live a very long life. If we can take that on board as a regular reflection, then it makes it much more likely to have insight into impermanence. It makes it more possible to observe impermanence without, because one of the reasons I think people don't like to observe impermanence is threatening. It's threatening to the sense of the self that wants a long life and wants security. But if we can become somewhat comfortable with the fact that it is going to end one day and there's nothing we can do about it, then it becomes, the mind itself is more receptive to noticing and contemplating. So one of the things that my elder sister, one of the things that happened in her dying process was after she stopped taking food and liquids, the body actually remained alive for 10 days. So she appeared to be sleeping from outside, no food, no water, but still breathing. All day, all night, another day, all day, all night, another day, all day, all night. Probably one of the things that was a factor in that, the people at the hospital said that it's normally 2 or 3 days, is if a person has the materialist assumption, if they think that this is their only life, that's another thing that we need to contemplate, because we hear that in the modern world, you only live once. And if a person has absorbed that as a kind of a teaching of wrong view, actually, but if a person has heard that a few times and actually thinks that, if that's the assumption, then there's going to be fear and anxiety about nihilism, complete destruction, it all being over. And then you're going to grasp at what you love and you cherish in this life. So my sister had a son, 19-year-old, who she loved very much, and she doesn't want to be separated from him. So there's that as well. There's a fear of there not being a future at all. There's fear of being separated from what you love. And so that was probably rather unpleasant. I did dream of my sister one night, and she did come to me and she says, "I'm tired, I just want to go now." And I was talking with a few people about other types of deaths. One story that a student friend in Mullumbimby area was telling me some stories of, I can't remember if it was mother or grandmother or great-grandmother, but one was a lady who was a Christian, and she was elderly, and she asked her friend to read her favorite Bible verse, and her friend read her favorite Bible verse, and then she said to her friend, "I feel a bit cold, can you bring me my shawl?" And the friend went to get the shawl, came back, and her friend had died that easily. Felt a bit tired, thinking about a teaching that she liked, heard the teaching, was feeling content, closed her eyes and went. The same person told me a story of a priest's wife, probably Protestant. And the wife was in church and she had an experience that she almost died. She said it was as easy as like throwing off a cloak of clothing and going on to the next. But she had some unfinished business. She said to her husband, "But I want to stay alive a bit longer." And a year passed, and then she came out of the shower and she called her husband's name. She said, "Quick, quick, quick, I'm going. Help me to dry myself. Help me to get my underwear on." She wanted to die with decency and composure. So he helped to dry his wife's body, helped her put her underwear on. She lay down on bed and she died. There's another story of a supporter who I have in Thailand whose father was quite close to Luang Por Tet. And when he retired, he spent Luang Por Tet as a famous disciple of Luang Por Man, believed to be an arahant. And so he was having tea with Luang Por Tet, spending more and more time in the monastery since he retired, and he was not very far from Luang Por Tet, having his cup of tea, put down his cup of tea, and literally fell on the lap of the arahant, and was dead. And so, I've said it before in other talks, I would like to die that way also. But my arahant didn't give me permission. But it's an interesting thing to observe. What did those three deaths have in common? Those people had a belief in a future life. And those people had a belief in some kind of goodness. And those people probably had a certain amount of goodness. So when you have a certain amount of goodness, you've been a good person, you're confident that there's an afterlife, you're mindful that death could occur, because there is that just simple acceptance of nature. These people knew when it was time. They weren't overcome with grasping and fear, and they were able to just go. So this is obviously one of the tremendous possible benefits of being mindful of death and accepting it, and being willing to go when it's time to go. But we don't know. We don't know when it's our time. And as I was saying, we have births, rebirths within our own life. When we're mindful of death, and when we have it as part of our worldview, that we want to cultivate goodness, then we can really change our lives within one lifetime. And when I met Nina, this center hadn't been built, the monastery hadn't been established, but with a lot of sincere effort, her son's good practice going forth, having a good teacher coming back. Now there's a beautiful monastery blossoming. You see the result of focused, consistent effort can bring new situations into being. 15 years ago, I was offered a piece of land, about 7 acres, and it was cornfields without trees, without a water system, without electricity, deep holes in a steep road. But I could see it had potential. And it was interesting, when I stood on that land, I had a feeling I'd never had before. I had a feeling like, I might die here, I could die here. It's a very strange thought to have. But there was a feeling of, that might be a good thing to die here. And now we have 80 acres of forest and 7 monks' dwellings, Dharma hall, Dana hall, water system, electrical system, road. We see what's possible when we are sincere and we make a commitment and we make a good effort. We can create a wonderful thing within our lifetime from literally nothing. So that's one of the benefits of belief in goodness and the benefit of hard work and skillfulness and effort, that it's worth doing. Sometimes, in the conventional reality, there is this life, there was a previous life, there'll be future lives. Many people who are Buddhists don't particularly want any more lives, but you don't actually stop rebirth by not wanting any more lives. The thing that binds us to the wheel of samsara is craving for and craving not for. So if you sit there thinking, I don't want to be born, I don't want to be born, I don't want to be born, you're going to be born. And you might not be born in a very happy situation. But if you understand that you have to practice generosity, be ethical, cultivate the Eightfold Path, have more mindfulness, more concentration, develop insight, you'll be having less and less births. So we have to work. The Eightfold Path is a set of conditions that leads to the unconditioned. But we have to work with those conditions. We have to lay the causes to get those results. About 4 years ago, I didn't know what I was going to do about my visa situation in Thailand. There's a situation where you get your visa extended year by year up to 10 years because I guess the understanding is foreign monks train for a period of time and then go back and spread the teachings to the countries they came from. Many foreign monks don't particularly want to come back after 10 years, so we disappear for a while and we come back and we start another 10 year. But after 20 years it gets harder because you can't really say you're just beginning and studying Buddhism if you've been doing it for 20 years. So they kind of give you up to about 20 years and then it's, But I liked my life but I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And this is the reason I mention this, is I think the power of making positive karma and making aspirational kind of dedications and setting one's goals very clearly. So I was traveling around various of Thailand's holy sites and meditating and then making the wish after my meditation, may I get my permanent residency visa. So I did that in the north of Thailand, the northeast of Thailand, central Thailand, southern Thailand. And I think probably the devas in Thailand were like, oh God, here he comes again. That Western monk with wanting his visa. And I did it in India also, so helped me with my visa in Thailand. But, at a certain point, I was invited to encourage the King of Thailand during COVID in a Dharma discussion and a guided meditation, and the King of Thailand asked, how's your visa situation? I'm like, I've applied for permanent residency, it's under consideration. Then he asked, would you like to be a Thai citizen? I would like that very much. Within 24 hours. So, and I didn't know until the day before that was going to happen. But the reason I mention that story is that if we sow causes, if we accumulate the types of merit that will support the goal we want, it's almost like a big positive affirmation. I knew when I started building my monastery that my future wasn't secure, but I went through all the motions. I helped to establish the forest. I raised scholarships for children, underprivileged children. I supervised the water system, electric system, infrastructure, knowing that I might not be able to live there one day. But I did it with the kind of some confidence, some faith, and some hope that the merit it produced, that I would also be taken care of. And in the end I was, in a way that I could not have anticipated. But that is like having the faith that sowing wholesome causes, helping others, your own needs will be taken care of. And so I do have great faith in that, and I am glad it worked out. At least so far so good. And so a little bit of a rambling contemplation about life and death within one's life, being prepared to go when it's time to go. And I have some connections with monks who have special abilities, and apparently my sister was reborn as a earthbound deva. What's interesting about that is when she was alive, she didn't believe in devas. So that must be an interesting experience for her now. I'm like, well, I guess they are real. And she didn't believe in rebirth either. And I was like, I guess there is one. And it's part of the reason I think that Jane was able to be reborn as a deva is because I was spreading metta to her for long periods of time. I had my students around the world chanting for her, dedicating merit to her. And of course our teacher, Ajahn Larry, and my teacher, Ajahn Anand, spreading metta to her. And so one of the things that can occur in Jane's situation, I believe it served her that she had a 10-day period where she couldn't leave her body. Because during that time, it's like we were able to pour in light, brighten the situation up. Because Jane didn't have a spiritual discipline and Jane didn't have a commitment to accumulating merit. But she did have a younger brother who was a bhikkhu. And I feel grateful to Jane because when I was a little boy, Jane used to give me my bath. Jane used to change the sheets of my bed once a week. So I was mindful that she helped me this lifetime. She also helped me to get one of my first jobs. So I thought I should try to help my sister. Sometimes when consciousness is about to leave a body, many people have an experience of seeing other relatives who've passed over or beings in other realms. And then I think for someone who has a materialist assumption, that must have a very interesting effect on the mind. It's like, oh, well, if there isn't life after death, how come these dead people are waiting for me? And there's a process of, and then I think that's quite humbling. And I think Jane was probably aware, like what, to the divine eye, for someone who has it, they would see merit as being light, being a bright quality, demerit as dark. Probably aware of streams of light coming in from somewhere. And she was probably aware of her own mind getting brighter, probably developed some gladness. And then she was, when the consciousness left the body, it went to a happy destination. So I believe that merit is real. And Lord Buddha said we shouldn't criticize people who do things for the sake of merit because merit is synonymous with happiness. Demerit, when we break precepts or when we hurt feelings of other beings with intention, what we create obstructions for ourselves and we put challenges in our path in the future. So this is why, teachings of all Buddhas, do good, avoid harm, purify the mind. This is a teaching of all Buddhas. So we all need to make efforts in that manner. But I wanted to give people the opportunity to ask questions also, so for now I'll offer that for your reflection.
Thank you, Ajahn. Just with the unification of the factors of the path, living in the city, I try to detach from samsara. I train hard and I read and I listen to Dharma, and I feel my ego is being fed. Like I don't do social media, I don't watch TV, I don't even have a TV. I've stripped a lot away, and I find that the immorality in samsara pulls me away from. I feel it, when sensual desire. I struggle with that's the only thing I've left to struggle with. I've let everything go. I try to practice the precepts as much as I can, and I find that when I'm training, when I'm practicing mindfulness and meditation, that if I'm acting out in samsara in any way, that that unification of the path, I know it's like a trilogy, samadhi and sila and panya, and that if I'm looking at like a pretty woman or having sensual thoughts, I find that my mind is restless, and when I try to train my mind and when I sit, there's more irritability and discontent, and it's harder to for the breath to become more fine and for the mind to settle. So how do I navigate that in this world? It's really difficult.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for the juicy subject. give me plenty to work with there. So it is difficult, and nobody's ever said it wasn't or isn't. Sexual craving is the most powerful of the things that bind us to samsara. So I think it's important. On one level, we try not to feed it. On another level, you try not to be contentious with it. I think on a certain level, we have to kind of accept, I'm not saying give into it, but I'm saying accept that, yeah, this is a really powerful phenomenon that I'm going to have to work with for some time. So that, I think just even that shift in attitude, like, don't make a problem out of it. It's like, okay, I need to contain this, I need to not indulge it to the degree that I'm capable of. And then it's a matter of working with it, and it's more like an aikido kind of a thing. So suppose you come to sit and there is a sensual, lustful fantasy. Well, I wouldn't recommend continuing to sit. I would say get up and do walking meditation. And do it fast, for example. It's like feel the feelings at the bottom of your feet. So you don't want to, if you've got that energy around your sitting, we all know we have an incredible fantasizing ability. And also with the amount of images we've absorbed because of the way media is, we can just use memory to get up some pretty amazing cinema happening in the mind. So if that's coming up in the mind and it looks obvious to you that the mind won't become peaceful within the next 10, 20, 15, 20 minutes, then do some walking meditation. Feel the feelings at the bottom of the feet. And this is what we do in the forest tradition. So it's like the monks would alternate sitting and walking. So if a monk comes back and sits, there's a lot of sexual energy, he'll probably go and walk quite fast for an hour, then come back and sit. It's like their energy goes into establishing a body-based awareness. And then you come and sit, there's less energy in the mind, it's been dissipated to some degree with the physical activity. Or the monk might go and sweep leaves, energetically. He might go and chop wood chips to make the robe dye. It's like sometimes you have to work with the energy a bit, like sublimation, it's sometimes called, like directing the energy in a different direction, but not indulging the fantasy. Another thing we can do is do a half an hour of chanting. So if you're going to chant in a language that you're not that familiar with, suppose you're going to chant the Dhammacakka Sutta in Pali. If you chant the Dhammacakka Sutta in Pali, most Western people don't know it by heart. You have to really pay attention to those words. And after the 20 minutes of chanting Pali words energetically, if you try to sit, you'll probably find there's not much sexual thoughts there. It's like changing gears, skillful distraction. So the mind is sometimes like a 3-year-old child. You take that, they're going to harm themselves, you take that thing out of their hand and you give them something less harmful. And we just need to know how to work with it. And so try not to get contentious with it, don't give into it, get some practice at skillful distraction, on skillful channeling into other avenues. And then generally, if you keeping the precepts and meditating, generally over a period of years, you can see that it cools down. The problem is, with modern people's attention span, we want those results within weeks or months, and probably realistically looking at years. But you can see after a period of years, if you keep to the standard and you do put forth a good effort and you develop some skills at how to channel energies differently, then you can see it gets better. But it's also good to know that you're in good company. When Luang Por Chah in his final life as a monk had some big struggles with lust. And the monk that was writing his biography, the first version, Ajahn Maha Amon, he wanted to take out one chapter where Luang Por Chah mentioned that he had an erection and his robe was rubbing against it. It was causing a sense, some discomfort, but also some arousal. So what do you do with that? So he lifted up his robe and walked, holding his robe in the air, with an erection in the forest. He didn't stop practicing. He didn't give in to it. He just kept up his practice. But this is an arahant in his final life. So it's just, and Ajahn Chah said, you must keep that in this biography. Don't deify me into something that wasn't human, that didn't struggle. This is really important. This has to be in there so that other people know when they experience this not to give up, to keep going. So he was quite, Luang Por Chah had quite an earthy sense of humor and kind of straight talking and monk's monk. And I think he's a really good example that one can see that within a lifetime where that was a struggle, by the time Luang Por Chah put down the khandas, he had no struggle with that at all. He completely went beyond that. So don't give up.
I've often wondered about when you're getting close to death, assuming you perhaps have a terminal disease or it's just terminal old age and you've got a strong feeling that there's not a lot of time to do. I know in the Tibetan tradition there's very strong practices they do, but in the Theravada tradition I'm not aware of what are the good things to be doing given that there's only a short span to go, assuming that, you assume there's only a short span to go.
So your dana, your sila, your bhavana, so your being, whatever practices that you have of being generous and keeping your precepts strictly, I mean, these are practices that support the mind in death. So if you've been generous, you've accumulated some good karma, you've been ethical, you've got nothing to feel particular heavy remorse about. And but we all make mistakes. So I think forgiveness practice is something I'd like to mention as well. Like we do need to forgive ourselves, forgive others before we get there. And then, but I think one of the strengths to Theravada practice is the simplicity. But one of the weaknesses is that people don't recognize the power of simplicity. So whatever meditation you do, when you train yourself to be present with the body and mind as it is, that's training for mindful death. So that sense of presence that one ideally has when one meditates, that's what we need when we're dying. It's just to carry the sense of presence of mind and clarity and knowing what's occurring without confusion. And then whatever's next will open up naturally and we won't get lost. We'll know which way to go because there's clarity, there's presence of mind. So more meditation is what I would say. And trust, trusting in that which knows, trusting in clarity. Because it actually produces a great deal of merit, and that's something that it's not a thought, it's not a concept, it's hard to understand that just making the mind clear and bright produces merit. And but it does. And Lord Buddha says that the bhavana, dana, sila, bhavana, the bhavana produces more merit than the being generous and being ethical. Sometimes we have to take, in Buddhism oftentimes, it's logical, it's rational, but some things we kind of have to take on faith a bit, that the Buddha is saying this produces more merit. You trust this. And the Arahants say the same thing. So, I would add another session of meditation, and add another session of chanting. Get familiar with resting in the space of awareness that knows a body as a body, feelings as feelings, thoughts as thoughts. And maybe sit a bit longer, sit more often, because you do want to get some practice of being with painful feelings. So that if that's part of the dying process, and it often is, that we've had some practice of being, oftentimes people get a bit uncomfortable, they'll get up. So it's like, don't do that. Sit for 10 more minutes. Get some practice at working with those painful feelings, of being okay while there's dukkha vedana. Chanting, I think, is a good thing to do. You want to know some chants so well that you can go to them. It's almost like a walking stick if you're on a slippery path, that you you have something that you can hold. Chant, and so, for Thais, most Thai Buddhists will just have some of their favorite chants. So the praises of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, the Itipiso, Sawakato, Supatipanno. Some people, as they get older, they will do it like 3 times a day or 3 times before sleeping, and as they get older, some people do it as many times as their age. So they increase the Itipiso, praises to the Buddha. Suppose you're 50, you do it 50 times, 51, 51 times, 55, 55 times. As they get older, they do it more. And so if a person does a practice like that, it goes in so deep. So in the Tibetan tradition, that might be your favorite mantra. A person just has the mantra that they do many hundreds, many thousands of times a day. It becomes something they can hold in their mind. Bodhikamma, we call in Pali. Thais, it might be Buddho, as we were doing with the breath. You can do awareness of breathing, Buddho, or it can just be a mental recitation, Buddho, Buddho, Buddho. We're training ourselves to hold on to something in our mind with mindfulness. That becomes part of our refuge of Dhamma. I have a very dear friend who hit his head and had a bleed, and he got on a plane, and this bleed inside his skull pressed on the part of the brain that affected memory. And so after a couple of days in Malaysia where I met him, we were supposed to be co-teaching a retreat. He didn't know who he was or where he was. So we took him to the hospital. He had to have a surgical procedure where the blood was washed away. And so he woke up, but he woke up in post-op in a hospital in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, wearing a blue hospital robe, not having his monk's robe, not having his bowl, and he had no memory of getting on a plane. He didn't know where he was. So I came in to see him post-op, and I was testing his memory. Who are you? And he knew his name. Who's your preceptor? He knew his preceptor. Who am I? He knew who I was. And okay. So do you know where you are now? No. Do you remember leaving Canada? No. But what was interesting was he wasn't anxious. So why I'm telling the story, he was where he was and he was okay. Even though he was separated from his robe, separated from his bowl, he could see that people were basically being nice to him. He had enough mindfulness to understand, I must have had surgery. He knew he was in Asia, but he knew it wasn't Thailand because they weren't speaking Thai. So I asked him, do you know where you are? And he's like, Asia? I'm like, yeah, you're in Malaysia. Oh. And then he told me later on in the day that when he woke up and he didn't know where he was, he just started chanting the Metta Sutta. So as soon as his memory came back, the thing that came to memory was that Lord Buddha said, when you find yourself in difficult circumstances, chant this sutta. So he did it automatically, because he's got a decade of being a bhikkhu. So that kind of thing, if we can chant a chant, and we can make that chant so familiar to us, it's like a friend, something we depend upon, that's the kind of thing that will help us in the dying process as well. Because he just chanted it quietly to himself, trusting that he'd probably be okay. And then I walked in and told him what had happened. And he had no memory of the previous week, but it all came back afterwards. He's okay now. Yeah.
We've talked about different forms of death. There's forms of death from dying from old age, dying from diseases and things like that. The one that I've struggled with the most, and I've experienced that in my life, is someone dying from suicide.
Right.
Would you care to give some advice and teachings based on that, please?
So, I mean, it's always a sad thing. And while for those of us who are alive and still have our faculties working, we have to, I think, train ourselves to understand that that's not actually an option. So that we have to work with our karma. You don't want to add more obstructive karmas on top of your karmas. So normally if it's a suicide, normally that person is experiencing some sadness or some frustration, some lack of hope. But it's not a good mind state to leave a life with. So those of us who are experiencing relative stability, relative comfort, or ordinary levels of challenges in our lives, we have to understand this before things get really difficult. And then if we understand that during the most difficult circumstances of our lives, if we've put some effort and discipline into practice, the difficult parts of our lives are the times where we can cultivate extra virtue. So a difficult period of time is when you can practice extra patience. A difficult period of time is when you can cultivate a capacity to be with painful feelings. And so when you're cultivating determination and patient endurance, these are qualities that you'll take with you to your next life if you cultivate them. But if when you come up with a challenge, your response is to want to end everything and aim ill will inwardly and not consider the feelings of others, it's not an evolution. It's not a good choice. So at the same time, we try not to be too judgmental, and we have to have compassion for people making what they thought was the best choice under painful circumstances. But in terms of a multi-lifetime paradigm towards liberation, it's usually not the best choice. If someone that we know did that and it causes us great pain, this is where our metta practice comes in. It's like you become aware of your pain, and one has to be skilled at filling the heart space with loving kindness. We have to replace sadness with metta. And it's perfectly possible to do it, and people should do much more of it, but people don't quite recognize the power of it. It's called replacement with opposites. If you have a negative emotion, you can change that emotion. You can replace it with a wholesome one. It takes discipline, it takes practice, it takes determination, but it's perfectly possible. Like the Buddha, these are sometimes called the sublime abidings, the divine abidings. So simply by acknowledging there's pain, separation from the loved. May I be well, may I be happy. May I be well, may I be happy. And you do that until the painful feeling is gone and all that's left is loving kindness. And then you can dedicate the merit of that to whoever it was that you knew who killed themselves. It's actually a wholesome response, and it may help them. I think assisted dying is an interesting thing that we need to put some thought into as well. It's I don't think the chemicals that they inject into people are very helpful for mindfulness. I think it's sometimes when the world gets too materialist, a lot of these things are about the people on the outside not experiencing discomfort. If the person appears not to be struggling, that's one of the things my brother was saying, that if my sister appeared to squirm or the breathing got more difficult, he would call the nurse over to give her more morphine and more sedative. But I don't know if that was helpful to Jane, but it was less unpleasant for the people in the room. As we want to go ideally with clarity and sobriety and presence of mind. We don't want the body to die when the mind is asleep. Because what's going to happen is the mind's going to wake up and there's not going to be a body. It's going to be confused. It's probably not going to make the best choices. So it's good to put some thought into that as well. And,
I have a twofold question. One is it that we assume that we are going to live for a certain period of time. But we also make the same assumption for the people around us, and we build our lives around that. So can you share more thoughts and reflections along those lines? And number two, we also have a fear that our loved ones may pass away. And we do our best to accommodate these feelings. So can you also share more thoughts about those?
yeah. I think because we live in cultures where there's a lot of news, are exposed to a lot of news, I think one of the best ways to train ourselves is when we see on television or on your news feed somebody died, a young person died, or a person died in an unexpected way, is that we have to remind ourselves in that moment that could have been me or my loved ones. We have to stop doing that's what happened to them. And there's this kind of, oh, isn't that terrible? Oh, they're so sad. And it's like, yes, it's terrible. Yes, it's sad. It's also something that happens, and we have to be kind of grown up about it. And we just have to acknowledge that could have been me. That could have been my wife or my child or my mother. I don't know when death is coming or how it's coming. We have to take it on as a practice. So in the forest tradition, it's one about chants. And so I'm of the nature to age, I've not gone beyond aging. I'm of the nature to sicken, I've not gone beyond sickening. I'm of the nature to die, I've not gone beyond dying. Another one, all that is mine, beloved and pleasing, will become otherwise, will become separated from me. Every day we do it. So it's like, when you do that, and it's kind of depressing, right? You look at that and it's like, my goodness, Theravada Buddhism. Aging, sickness, death, separation. Well, when things are going well, that seems like unnecessarily depressing, right? But when something horrible happens and the Theravadan Buddhists are like, yeah, I knew that could happen, they might not waste a lot of time with heavy grief and dejection and depression and sadness that the people that didn't want to think about it may have to deal with. So that's the 5 recollections frequently taught. The last one is a karma. I am the owner of my karma, heir to my karma, born of my karma, abide supported by my karma. Whatever karma I shall do, of that I shall be the heir. So the thing is, the Theravadan Buddhism is presented as a package. We don't just do the 5 reflections, then we also do the reflections on the 4 Brahmaviharas, the metta chant, the may all beings be well, may all beings be happy, may they abide in well-being, may all beings not be separated from their good fortune. So it's like a complementary thing. It's like, this is the bitter medicine and this is the honey that you mix in with it. And then it's palatable. But we do have to be disciplined. And so we're fortunate because it's a part of the package. We have to do the awareness of death, sickness, aging, separation, as well as metta, karuna, mudita, upekkha. So sometimes I remember we did the chanting at 3:30 in the morning, and everyone's got a kind of a deep voice, and energy's a bit low, and the monks are doing this. I am of the nature to die. I'm not gone beyond dying. I remember when I was 21, 22 at Wat Nanachat, I'm like, oh my God, what am I doing here? And then we do the body parts: blood, bones, excrement. But at the end of the session, it's the loving kindness chant and the dedicating merits chant, and it all gets very illustrious and beautiful and sharing and nice. So it's a balance. Sometimes I look back and I can't quite believe I made it, but here we are.
I didn't have a question. I'd just like to pay my respects for all your wonderful Dharma talks throughout the years. They've just brought up a lot of virya and energy whenever I'm being pulled by samsara and the worldly beings. So thank you, Bhajan.
Nice to know. Yeah, I feel a lot of gratitude in my life for, as I was saying earlier, the confusion I felt as a young man wondering what I was going to do with my life. And when I did find this training, this lifestyle, and noticed how much less suffering I had, more clarity I had, then there was a feeling of wanting to help others to receive the benefit I'd received. So being very grateful to my own teachers and the teachings, I do try to share what I can, and glad it helps some people.